Chapter 36, Section 3, Implementing LBJ's Great Society. Johnson took his decisive election victory as a mandate to move forward with his Great Society agenda. Long before the election, he had begun work on civil rights and anti-poverty programs. Now he's ready to move forward with a broad range of proposals for improving life for all Americans. The Johnson treatment gets results in Congress. In contrast to Kennedy, who had trouble getting his legislative program through Congress, many of Johnson's bills passed. Having served in Congress for more than 2 decades, Johnson knew how to deal with legislators. He praised them publicly, sought their advice, returned their calls, and instructed his aides to do the same. Or else. When all else failed, the president subjected lawmakers to the treatment. 2 journalists described Johnson's persuasive powers in this way. Its tone could be supplication, accusation, cajolery, exuberance, scorn, tears, complaint, the hint of threat. Johnson moved in close, his face a scant millimeters from his target, his eyes widening and narrowing, his eyebrows rising and falling. From his pockets poured clippings, memos, statistics. The treatment was an almost hypnotic experience and rendered the target stunned and helpless. Rowland Evans and Robert Novak, Lyndon B. Johnson, The Exercise of Power, 1966. The treatment, along with a Democratic-controlled Congress after 1965, helped Johnson compile an extraordinary legislative record. In the 5 years of his presidency, he shepherded more than 200 measures through Congress. Ending racial injustice. Johnson envisioned a society free of racial injustice. One of his first priorities as president was a passage of Kennedy's civil rights legislation banning discrimination in public accommodations. No memorial oration, Johnson said, could more eloquently honor President Kennedy's memory than the earliest possible passage of a civil rights bill. Several months later, Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 into law. The new law was quickly tested in the courts. The case known as Heart of Atlanta Motel versus United States arose when a motel owner refused to rent rooms to blacks. He argued that the Civil Rights Act overstepped the power given to Congress to control interstate commerce. He also claimed that it violated his rights under the 5th and 13th Amendments by forcing him to use his property in ways he opposed. The Supreme Court rejected these claims. It noted that much of the motel's business came from out-of-state guests. Hence, Congress had acted within its power to regulate interstate commerce. Johnson continued to push Congress to end racial injustice. In 1965, he signed the Voting Rights Act, which guaranteed voting rights to African Americans. 3 years later, he signed the Civil Rights Act of 1968, which prohibited housing discrimination. These laws helped move the country toward Johnson's vision of a colorblind society. Declaring war on poverty. Another goal that both Kennedy and Johnson shared was the elimination of poverty. Spurred by Michael Harrington's book, The Other America, Kennedy had asked his advisors to develop strategies for attacking poverty. Johnson expanded these ideas into an ambitious anti-poverty program called the War on Poverty. The centerpiece of the War on Poverty was the Economic Opportunity Act. Passed by Congress in August 1964, the act created dozens of federal anti-poverty programs and an Office of Economic Opportunity to oversee them. One program, the Job Corps, worked to teach disadvantaged young people job skills. Project Head Start set up programs for low-income preschool children. Volunteers in Service to America, or VISTA, was modeled on the Peace Corps. VISTA volunteers lived and worked in poor communities within the United States, providing job training or educational services. President Johnson also hoped to reverse the decline of America's cities. In 1965, he created the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, to manage federal programs aimed at revitalizing blighted urban neighborhoods. Its head, Robert Weaver, was the first African American to join any president's cabinet. Improving access to health care. Also high on Johnson's list of Great Society goals was helping needy Americans gain access to health care. Liberals in Congress had tried for years to provide hospital insurance to retired workers as part of Social Security. Johnson made this measure a top priority. In 1965, Congress established the Medicare and Medicaid programs. Medicare is a federal health insurance program that pays for hospital and nursing home services for citizens 65 years or older. Medicaid is a health insurance program jointly financed by federal and state governments. It covers low-income people as well as older Americans whose medical needs have exceeded their Medicare benefits. With the creation of these programs, many Americans no longer had to forego medical care for lack of health insurance. Supporting lifelong learning and culture. Education, Johnson believed, was the key to a better life. He pushed several measures to improve the nation's educational system. One was the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, which provided federal aid to school districts nationwide. Because the government allocated funds to needy students rather than to schools, the act helped finance both public and parochial or faith-based education. That same year, Johnson signed an act creating the National Endowment for the Arts, NEA, and the National Endowment for the Humanities, NEH. These organizations give grants to artists, musicians, writers, scholars, and researchers to promote a vibrant national culture. Johnson also spearheaded passage of the Public Broadcasting Act of 1967. While we work every day to produce goods and create new wealth, he explained upon signing the act, we want most of all to enrich man's spirit. That is the purpose of this act. The act established the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, CPB, which supports the development of public radio and television programs. One of the first CPB-funded shows was Sesame Street, which first aired on public television stations in 1969. Opening doors for immigrants. Johnson also supported a major overhaul of the nation's immigration policy. Since the 1920s, the government had placed quotas on immigration from every part of the world except Western Europe. Johnson, who believed this quota system was rooted in prejudice, wanted to end it. The Immigration Act of 1965 eliminated the old quotas based on national origin. It made a person's skills and ties to family in the United States the key criteria for admission into the country. Johnson praised the act for repairing a very deep and painful flaw in the fabric of American justice. He had no idea what an impact the law would have. In the years since its signing, immigration has quadrupled, with immigrants arriving from all over the world. Preserving the environment. In striving toward the Great Society, Johnson hoped to improve the quality of environment for all. In 1962, the publication of the book Silent Spring by Rachel Carson had raised public interest in environmentalism, or protection of the environment. The book showed how uncontrolled pesticide use was poisoning the environment. The air we breathe, our water, our soil, our wildlife, Johnson warned, are being blighted by poisons and chemicals, which are the byproducts of technology and industry. Johnson worked with Congress to pass several environmental laws. The Clean Air Act of 1963 set emission standards for factories to reduce air pollution. Other laws focus on cleaning up waterways, preserving wilderness, protecting endangered species, and beautifying the landscape. Protecting consumers. Johnson also supported consumerism, or the protection of the rights of consumers. The Cigarette Labeling Act of 1965 required cigarette packages to carry labels warning that smoking could cause health problems. Other acts set standards for wholesome meat and poultry products, for truth in lending practices, and for honest labeling of food. In 1965, the book Unsafe at Any Speed, written by Ralph Nader, focused public attention on auto safety. It showed how lax engineering standards in the automobile industry had put drivers at risk. The book spurred Congress to pass the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act of 1966. This law required automobile manufacturers to install seatbelts in all cars. Debating the Great Society. By the early 1970s, the impact of Johnson's Great Society reforms could be seen in many areas of life. The poverty rate had fallen from 22.2% of Americans in 1960 to just 12.6% in 1970. High school graduation rates were rising. In 1962, only about 42% of black students and 69% of white students completed high school. By 1970, those rates had climbed to about 60% for blacks and 80% for whites. African American participation in politics was growing as well. By 1970, 10 members of the House of Representatives and 1 senator were black. Despite these successes, the Great Society had its critics. The war on poverty proved especially controversial. Left-wing opponents complained that its mix of programs was not the best approach to ending poverty. In their view, poverty resulted from social and economic forces beyond the control of the poor. The best way to help low-income people, they argued, was to give them money while trying to change the economy to create more jobs for them. Critics on the right alleged that the war on poverty was creating an underclass of people who were dependent on government welfare. In their view, poverty's main cause was a lack of individual responsibility on the part of the poor. The best approach to ending poverty, they argued, was to find ways to change the behaviors that kept poor people poor. At the heart of the debate over Johnson's Great Society were age-old questions about the proper role of government in a democracy. Liberal supporters applauded the scheme's broad goals, and multitudes of programs aimed at improving American life. Their main concern was that many of the programs were not funded well enough to achieve those goals. Conservative critics, on the other hand, saw the Great Society as government run amok. The high cost of many Great Society programs confirmed their belief that government should not try to solve all of society's problems. Johnson's presidency proved to be a high point for the liberal view of government as society's problem solver. After he left office, world events caused liberals to lose ground to more conservative politicians. Still, the Great Society left a lasting imprint on American life. Few Americans today voice a desire to do away with Medicare, Sesame Street, or consumer protections. Many such products of the Great Society have become fixtures of American life.